Hi, everybody, and welcome to Designing DS Contracts. So my name is Dawn, and I am half of Dan and Dawn. And usually we present together when we're in person. 98% of the time we present together when we're in person. On Zoom, Dan has decided he doesn't want to sit still for that long. So I'm teaching the classes. I love Zoom. I love to do these classes. I love to share this information. So here we go. First, a couple of little disclaimers. I am recording, so please stay on mute. I'll stop recording and then have time for question and answers, which is sometimes where the good stuff comes in. I teach from experience. And I'm a storyteller. So I've been teaching this stuff for over 20 years at this point, and I have a lot of stories to share. Now, it's also going to feel like a fire hose because I'm talking at you instead of with you. So it's going to be a lot of information presented to you. Okay. There may be naughty language. I only advertise this on FET. So I give that warning because I've caught somebody by surprise before and got chastised for it. So now I give the disclaimer, naughty language. We will be talking about naughty stuff. Not as naughty as I'd like to, but that's okay. Like I said, I'm Dawn of Dan and Dawn. Dan and I have been together since 1999. Oh, holy cow, I missed our anniversary. That happens when you get old. So 3 days ago, 3 days ago, we've been living together for 25 years. That was actually a big anniversary. It's okay, he didn't remember either. So 3 days ago, we've been together for 25 years. And when we got together, we had both come out of vanilla relationships. And when we got together, we decided that we were going to create something totally unique and very different. Now, we talked about that and worked on that for almost a year and a half, which is what this class is about. And in March 3rd of 2001, we became formally collared. So we've been collared for a very long time. But we created that relationship through designing a contract. That's the stories I'll be sharing with you today. We've been collared since 2001, presenting since 2004, author of a few books at this point, but the Power Exchange books, we are authors of Living a Mess, and we'll have news about that coming out soon to our patrons first, because it's been out of print for a little while. We are authors of Hearts and Collars, and we are authors of Lead, Follow, Love with Kevin and Katie Casey. And this just came out a couple of days ago. All of our Kickstarter people now have their copies. And this is the four of us talking about our two very different power exchange relationships. Authority transfer relationships is what some people call it. And so super excited about that. And then I am the co-host of the Erotic Awakening podcast, which is now 15 and a half years old. We just recorded episode 704 last night with Kevin and Katie, so over 700 shows. I'm outside of Chicago right now, which is where the Leather Archives and Museum is, and they actually want me to get all of those episodes downloaded so that they can put them in the Leather Archives. I don't know how to do that. That's 700 shows. That feels like a lot of work. I need to figure out how to do that while I'm here. It's not going to fit on a thumb drive. I'll figure out something. Okay, so like I said, everything else that we do can be found on eroticawakening.com. Classes, sign up for the newsletter, blah, 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 all that stuff. All right, so why DS contracts? Okay, so again, a little story about Dan and I. When we got together, all we had, there was no FetLife back in 99. There was no Google back in 99. And at least two of you have heard this story before. I'm sorry. You get to hear it again. So all we had was bulletin boards, magazines, books. I came across one magazine that was literally called Power Exchange. And that was, I have one copy of that magazine with me right now. I'm donating it to the Leather Archives and Museum. So I don't know how many of them that they have. So I've got that. I came across another magazine from a swing, not a swing, from an adult bookstore. I was looking at swinging magazines and came across another one where there was a guy with his hand, and he just had her face in his hand, and she was looking up at him adoringly. And you could tell there was something going on there that I absolutely wanted. And then I got on an IRC chat, so Internet Relay Chat, so IRC. I got on there and I got on one of their rooms, and Dan and I were just friends at the time. We'd never had any sort of naughty relationship, and just friends. And he's like, "Oh, you found IRC? Did you know there's naughty channels on that?" I'm like, "No." He's like, "Yeah, let me give you a list of some naughty channels." And I found Ohio BDSM and started meeting people through that, and or talking to them. And he's like, "So are you going to go meet anybody in person?" And I'm like, "Well, actually, I've been invited to like a demo thing, and I'm taking the husband, my vanilla husband at the time, because I had, oh man, everything was, yes, I had found home. I really wanted to dig more into BDSM. So I took the now ex-husband with me, totally freaked him out. I was like, "Whoa, this is what I want. This is home. Oh, I'm sorry it freaked you out. And now, because of other things as well, I think it's time for me to move on." So after 14 years, we split. And then I started talking to Dan, and I'm like, "So guess what I did? And guess what I saw? And guess what I," and he's like, "You really went?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah." He's like, "I want to know more." And then him and his wife split up for different reasons as well. Universe works out like that. And Dan and I got together and we're like, "You know what? The vanilla didn't work out. Look at all this kinky stuff that we're finding. Maybe we can build a relationship like that." Now, Dan and I were from IT, and in IT, you build plans, you build things with mission statements, you design things. And then we found in LA, National Leather Association, and we started talking to people in there. And they're like, "Oh, well, have you thought about building a contract?" And nobody there was really power exchange. We met one person that did have a history of leather S&M, and everybody else was pretty much kinksters without designing that sort of a relationship. And we were trying to design the relationship. We couldn't find anybody else local that had done this. And she was like, there's things that you can do. You can create a contract. And that made me feel, that hit my safety trigger. I was like, "Oh, that makes me feel safe to have something in writing." I mean, I'm deciding to become a follower, a slave, a submissive. At the time was the language that I used, dominant and submissive. Ooh, I've always, 14 years of marriage, I had to be in charge of my marriage. I hated it, but I had to be in charge of it. And now I'm going to surrender and let someone else be in charge. Ooh, but we get to put down rules and expectations and things like that. I kind of like that. And so, because we didn't have like role models, and we were kind of creating this from scratch and creating it from fantasy books, basically, and fantasy stories, we're like, "So how can we make something that's fantasy into something that's viable? How can we make this real and not just on the weekends?" Right? We wanted our whole relationship to be about this. Now, Dan's coming from two previous vanilla marriages. And in both of those, it was very much the keep the wife happy sort of thing to keep the arguments from happening. My marriage was a chess match. And the person that won the game was the one that yelled the loudest, the longest. So very, very dysfunctional. And that's what we got from our families. That's just kind of what we learned to deal with. And if you look on media, that's a lot of what you see, right? You know, guys lie until they get caught. You know, people step out on each other, all this stuff. And we just didn't want that. We wanted to really create what it was that we were looking for. We wanted to create a relationship about truly what made us wet and hard. And then how do you take all of that into something that, I mean, and I was bringing kids into it. I was bringing a 12 and an 8-year-old into it. Man, how do you design something like that when you've got them to raise as well, right? So we decided to take our friend Jan's suggestion and write a contract. Now we asked around to other people, and there were some people that are like, no, 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 you don't need a contract. When you submit, that's it, end of story. And I'm like, I don't know that that works for me. I need a box. I need steps. I need expectations and rules. I need a voice. How am I going to have a voice in this relationship? Right? Do I get a voice? Well, we better discuss that because I need to know before we step in and things blow up because we don't know what we're doing. So, what is a DS contract? I mean, we had to look at that at first. We would tell people, "Oh, we're working on our contract." And a lot of times the first response was, "Well, that's not legal." Well, we know it's not legal, right? A DS contract is not legal. It's not supposed to be legal. It's supposed to be a tool, or at least that's how we saw it. Okay. We use the word contract because we're going into it with honor and we're expecting each side to hold up their end of the bargain. You know, it's a negotiated contract. So that's why we use that language. But the intent is not for it to be legal. So it's an agreement written between multiple parties. There could be more than two to solidify understanding. I mean, some of the things that Dan and I figured out to begin with was that I would say submissive and mean one thing, and he would say submissive and mean something else. So, if nothing else, this is a conversation starter. You guys get to talk about terminology and what different words mean to you, what your experience is, what your fantasy is. You know, you get to talk about all of that. A DS contract is a clear statement of goals. Dan and I are very goal oriented, right? Just look at our list of projects. But even in our relationships, you know, we're goal oriented, we're growth oriented. So it's a clear statement of goals and, like I said, expectations, wants, needs, desires. You get to look deep within yourself and try to figure out what it is that you really want, you know, get beyond the surface and get kind of dig in deep there. So some pros and cons to a DS contract, and I also want to throw out there, I'm using the language DS contract. If you saw the class description, there's all kinds of things that this can be called. It can be an MS contract, a master slave contract, a power exchange agreement or contract, authority transfer agreements or contracts, whatever verbiage that you use. All of this information can be used towards those. DS contract is just the easiest for me to remember. So, pros and cons of a contract, right? For me, I love that it's a proactive approach to a relationship instead of a reactive approach, right? Think about the things that could go wrong or the things that you might like. Think about all that beforehand and put it in this document instead of something blowing up and then you have to backtrack and then wait till you're in a good space to think about it and then design something. Even though you're not going to be able to think of everything at the beginning, there will be some reactive stuff that you add later, I'm sure. But this class is part of figuring out how to be proactive with some of the things to think about to put in there. Okay. So proactive instead of reactive. To me, it is the ultimate communication tool. I mean, I could always go back and reflect on what we had talked about when we were in a good space. I was in a some sort of bad space or wasn't dealing with something well, we could always go back to that. We wrote it when we were in good space. We wrote it as peers. Now, if you're in leather community, you will hear all kinds of things about contracts. Okay. Some people have told me, some dominants have told me that they write the contract. They present it to the submissive, and the submissive says yes or no. End of story. Some have told me that the submissive writes the contract, presents it to the dominant, and the dominant is yes or no. I can provide that or I won't provide that. For me and Dan, neither one of those really worked. We wanted to co-create this relationship. Okay. I'm not saying either of the other ones is wrong. There is no right way to do this. This is how Dan and I did it that worked for us. Okay. We've been doing this for 20 some years at this point. So this contract has held solid, and I'll give some hints as to how that can happen, because in 20 years you change, right? You don't stay stagnant, especially when we're growth oriented. So more pros is that it's clear. Make it as clear as possible. Doesn't mean that there won't be some stuff that's muddy that you look at later and go, what the fuck was I thinking of? I don't even know what this means. That can happen and does happen, especially as you change and grow. But for the most part, it's pretty clear. And that's what the purpose is. It can be referred to later as my memory ages, as both of our memory ages. It's nice to have some things in writing because we can remember things differently than how they happened or what was said. So when it's in writing, it's really great to reflect back on. When the relationship stalls, which it will, when it hits speed bumps, which it will, it's great for refocusing. It's great to be a conversation starter. It's like, 5 years ago when we wrote this, this is what we said. Now this is becoming a problem. Do we need to talk about this? Right? So it'll help you with the speed humps, whatever you call them, the speed bumps, the speed humps, refocuses. Now, cons of DS relationships or DS contracts. I couldn't think of any. So if you can think of any cons, leave them for the end. Yeah. So leave it for the end and we'll bring them up, and maybe I'll add them to my notes for later, because cons of a contract. So let me think. Maybe I've got a few. Probably the only con that I can think of off the top of my head is feeling like I can't change the contract. So that could be one where maybe someone feels like they're locked in. So, yeah, too rigid, too locked in. Absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's probably the only one I can think of at the moment. I'm curious what people might have during the Q&A at the end. Now, some of the detractors of a contract. So some of the things that people say about a contract for a reason not to have one. For one, some masters that we've talked to over the years, their thought on this is that they don't need a contract, nothing in writing, because their word is their word, which means what they say goes. And that's always the bottom line. Okay. And I get that. And that's kind of hot, but it's not going to help me when I feel like I have something to discuss and don't know how to discuss it. And we haven't talked about how I'm going to communicate something I have an issue with. Whereas with a contract, you can think about that. Again, it's a tool. You can think about that ahead of time and have already discussed it before the situation happens. Proactive, right? Others have said, well, you'll outgrow it. Yeah, we expect to outgrow it. For us, once we solidified the contract, once we signed it, had a party, celebrated it, officially collar around my neck, then once a week for the first year, every Sunday morning, we would go out to breakfast and go over a piece of it just to keep it fresh because it's such a new way to do a relationship for us. This was very new. So it kind of kept us solid. And as we outgrew pieces, we would make a suggestion of maybe it needs to change. Now, what we had decided in our contract that either one of us could bring up changes, Dan got final say. Once I signed that contract, Dan got final say on whether anything changed in the contract. So we created it as equals, we created it as peers, because I was already getting into a submissive space with him and he wanted to make sure that I was creating something as a peer and not just to please him, which I can fall into. So, so we did that. And then, yeah. So, but then after I signed it, I can bring something up, but he makes a decision on whether it actually gets changed in the contract or not. And then every year on the anniversary, we would go through the whole thing to see if we had outgrown any of it. Maybe you put in some rituals in there or some protocols that just didn't work, right? Why keep them in there if they don't work? Maybe you came across someone else that did something differently and you wanted to try it or change your focus. So every year we would redesign the contract. Some people would say that it gives the sub too much power. I never found this to be the case. Once I submitted to Dan, I submitted to Dan. So, I mean, there's a before and an after of signing the contract. So, we had to discuss some things that I thought I wanted to see if it actually was what I wanted. Some things I wanted to put in there for my safety, and not safety, but feeling of safety, which is different. When you've got past baggage, there's some things that you want to happen just so that you feel safer, even if it's mentally. And Dan likes to be trusted. So we had to negotiate some of the things that we put in there. Uh, an example will probably pop into my head in about 10 minutes. So I'll blurt it out if it pops into my head. Let's see. Some people were saying that a contract prevents growth and it's not adaptable. And I've already given you examples about how it was adaptable for us. And it does just the opposite of preventing growth. It actually encouraged growth because what we did was we actually gave ourselves a theme each year. So our first year of the contract was building our foundation. The second year of the contract was high protocol. So we spent time and time just fine tuning, the foundation and really setting the foundation as power exchange. But then the second year was high protocol, and that was phenomenal. My extremely shy, introverted self at the time loved high protocol. I got to walk behind Dan wherever we went. He never introduced me to anybody. My head was bowed all the time. I was totally focused on him and just him and didn't have to, yeah, I didn't have to interact with people. I mean, it was actually fun that second year, right? So I had two interventions that year of people that thought I was in a bad place. And one came to my home and they're like, "So I'm just checking. Are you okay? Is Dan oppressing you?" And I'm like, "Oh no, no, I'm in my happy place. Oh, this is yay. I don't have to interact with people. I get to wear my leather and just walk behind him and just be on point all the time." I mean, whew, total focus. It was phenomenal. It actually helped me with my PTSD. because my focus was completely on him and our power exchange relationship. And that was just phenomenal. So I got rid of the fears of the first person that did the intervention. And then the second person was not in the kink community. She was met her at a drumming circle, and she saw that I was walking behind Dan. And we didn't display our power exchange, but it was kind of obvious still that I was walking behind him and he had his hand on my belly. I love his hand on my belly. It is so steadying and it helps me go into new places and things like that. It's like he's my rock and he's putting his hand on my belly. Well, she was very much into women empowerment and had a conniption fit. So she took me out for tea. And 3 hours, man. I printed out all this stuff as to why DS was okay and, what I got out of it, and I wrote some things down because I knew I would lose my train of thought, and I brought this little yellow folder with all my stuff in it about how this is a viable relationship and kink and, and all this stuff, and I chatted and I talked, and man, she just wasn't getting it, and things were starting to get more spaghetti coming out of my mouth. I just couldn't make sense of the words, trying to put words to the feelings that I got. So at the end of 3 hours in this poor little tea shop, I'm like, I close the folder and I'm like, bam, I'm like, "You're a feminist, right?" She's like, "Yes." I'm like, "So am I." She looked at me funny. And I'm like, "The idea of feminism is that I get to do what makes me happy, regardless of the fact that I am female." And she's like, "Yes, that's right." I'm like, "This makes me happy." And she's like, "Wow, you should have said that 3 hours ago, and we just could have enjoyed tea instead of going head to head, right?" So I was able to explain that to her. Now, funny thing is that just a couple years after that intervention, her and her husband became big dogs in Columbus, Ohio, and started running the two big hotel takeover events that were there. They did that for 12 years. So between me and Dan being the power exchange and polyamory people in Columbus and them being the sex positive kink people there, and then we went into business together and ran a dungeon. So I'm glad she stepped in and did that intervention, and I'm glad it turned out the way it did. But you know, eh, so year two, again, some people have heard this story. Year two was high protocol and the interventions. Year three was a slut year. So Dan and Dawn are going to embrace their sluthood, and that was so much fun that year four continued to be year of the slut, and year five continued to be year of the slut. And by year six, we decided we didn't have to rewrite the contract anymore because we had found our groove. So 24 years later, we'll still reflect on things that we wrote in the contract. We'll still look at it to see if things, I mean, we've changed our language. We've gone from Dom sub, DS, to master slave, MS, to Bellum and Belet, which is words that Dan kind of made up so that we could create who we are in these roles and not be boxed in to Dom sub or MS, right? So lots of changes. So when we hit our 20-year anniversary, that's when we made that language change and re-looked at our relationship and our contract and everything with it to see if this was still the most beneficial style of relationship for us, that we still wanted to continue co-creating it. And we decided yes, that we did, because we don't know how to interact with each other. And I could not imagine going vanilla with Dan. No, we're a little more casual in our power exchange now, but the buck still stops with him. And if we're in leather environments, I still have protocols that I have to follow that are from 20 some years ago. So one of the reasons to have, or more reasons to have a contract, is just that for us, to me, it felt like what I was reading was that submissives were dependent, masters were independent, and that just didn't feel right to me emotionally. And what we figured out is that we're interdependent. So this contract helped us figure out how to work together and create what it is we were looking to create. All right. Now, in this day and age, holy cow, you guys have resources. FET, I think I've been on FET since 2008. I think that's when it was designed, maybe a little bit before that in Canada, and then it came to the, was available in the States. And I think my oldest picture is from 2008, and I'm one of the first people on there ish. So FET's been around forever, and you can get all kinds of information on FET. Some of it good, some of it not so good, right? You've got you don't have to dig up bulletin boards. There are Discord servers now. And though I love the Erotic Awakening Discord server, but I can't figure out how to find other servers that are topics of what I'm looking for. I have to know someone that knows someone that knows the link that can send me an invite. So it's all, yeah, but there's lots of Discord servers out there. There's there's an event in the States. There's an event every weekend. There are multiple weekend long hotel events, conferences every weekend. When Dan and I get invited to present at a conference, we have to look at our calendar and make sure that there's nothing that weekend that we might get invited back from the previous year and that there's no conflicts. And when people are in the same region, they try to work together so that they're not having conferences at the same time and people have to split their money and just, I mean, it's crazy how many events there are. Forget it, that's not counting munches and online classes and all these other classes and intensives. And Dan and I, this is just after 4 years of COVID, and Dan and I are teaching more in-person events a year than we were before COVID. So this year, I think Cleveland would have been number 16, but Cleveland got hit by a tornado and it wiped out their electric for their dungeon. So we didn't get over there over the weekend, but we'll be teaching in Chicago in a couple of weeks, Kansas City a couple of weeks after that. We've got 5 events set up this winter in Phoenix. I mean, the education is phenomenal. So you guys have lots of places to pull resources from. You've got lots of opportunity to talk to couples to see how they do their contracts if they have contracts. Like I said, this is just one way. So let me tell you a little bit about our contract and some key ingredients that we put in here. Now, I also want to mention that in Living MS, we wrote a little bit about our contract, and people would come to us and they'd be like, so how do you write a contract? And I'd be like, oh, just go look at Living MS. We wrote about it in there. A little while later, I went back and looked at the book. I think we wrote like 3 paragraphs. So then we wrote Hearts and Collars. And when we wrote Hearts and Collars, this whole class is in that book. So everything I'm discussing here, plus more, is in Hearts and Collars. We took Living MS and put it on steroids and just created a huge thing. So some considerations with contracts, all right? Dan has me, who is his alpha, and excuse my verbiage. I'm just going to throw words out there. I don't know that I agree totally with all of them, but the way I kind of describe it is that I'm his primary alpha slave, long-term life partner, right? I live with him. We have mixed finances, all that type of stuff. Full-time, total power exchange. Dan also has other people in his collar and has had other people in his collar over the last 2 decades. Some of them are long distance. He's got 2 that are long distance right now. One is in Chicago, which is why we're parked here for a couple of months. The other one is in Phoenix, which is why we'll be parked there for a couple of months in the winter. So your contract should reflect that, right? Long distance relationship is going to have very different expectations than someone that lives in your 30-foot box with you that can hand you coffee by leaning over this way and then leaning over this way. It's a very different ritual than what we used to have for coffee. So it should reflect your circumstances. Is it a training relationship? And that's kind of a funny word because I don't particularly like the idea of dominant collaring a submissive to train them and there's sex and play involved. Play maybe, sex no. Anyway, we do a whole podcast on that. So just kind of go with the flow on this. So is it a loving relationship? Is it just teaching them a skill? Sometimes people come into Dan's collar and they're like, you know what? I would love to be in your collar because I want to see what the submission feels like. And Dan will design a contract for 3 months. It's not a long-term thing. They just want to see what it's like. So he'll create it for 3 months, and as peers, they will discuss what this 3-month relationship will look like, what it will entail, what the expectations of each person is, right? And each role. And then at the end of 3 months, they'll bring it back to the table. Once again, they'll be peers. Dan will take the temporary collar off and they'll discuss it again and see if they want to make it for longer or change some things about it. So think of that when you go to design the contract. Is it long distance? Is it full time in your house? Is it a all encompassing power exchange or not? When Bat was in Dan's collar, Bat was a professor at a university. Bat had a kid. Bat had her own finances. Dan didn't want control of any of that. He didn't want to tell her how to raise her teenager. He didn't want anything to do with her job steps and if she was trying to get tenure or not. So what is in the scope of the contract? What is out of the scope of the contract? You are co-creating this. You are creating the relationship. It can be what you want it to be. You don't have to listen to what other people do in their relationships, right? So, what does it include? What does the dominant want power over? And what does the submissive want them to have power over? For me, it's complete. Dan has power over everything. So even though we can come across as casual sometimes when we're hanging around our polyamorous peeps or friends or whatever, my whole internal attitude is he's in charge. And even though I'm not on point the way I used to be in year 2, I've got enough experience to still know when his coffee cup is empty, even though he's given up coffee for the next 3 months. So that's kind of weird. That'll change your contract and expectations up a little bit. Go with the flow. Yeah, so just keep in mind of what the relationship can involve, okay, and what each person wants out of it. Some of the key ingredients to think about for Dan and I, this was very much a lesson on honesty, being honest with each other and being honest with ourselves. I had never been asked, what are your needs, wants, and desires? What do you mean, what are my needs? Air, food? No, no, no. What are your needs in a relationship? Oh, I'd never given it any thought. I mean, at 17, I started dating the ex-husband. It was Dan's first wife, which was my best friend in high school that actually set me up with his best friend, who is my first husband. Try to keep that one straight. And I needed to be rescued from my family of origin. And he's who I was dating. So we got a place together. And then the grandparents had a conniption fit because we weren't married. So we got married and then we were married. So we had kids. And then 14 years later, I'm like, I find kink and I'm like, yes, I need to get out. So I'd never been asked what I wanted in a relationship. I was kind of pushed with each thing that happened. Other key ingredients, at least for mine and Dan's style of contract, is that it's the responsibility of both parties, right? So that's that whole peer thing. Both of us have to drive this, both of us have to talk about this. We made sure not to have assumptions when we went in. Okay. We both came in with assumptions. We both had to realize we came in with assumptions and we had to talk about the assumptions, right? We made it for a time limit. Like I said, a year and a day is what we went with. And then at a year and a day, we totally discussed it again, totally redesigned it, gave it another year and a day, had a party, and went for another year. So, so Jan in LA, we took her advice to create this contract. And then she's sitting down with us and she's like, have you built an exit clause? And I'm like, an exit clause? Why? We're building a relationship. Why would I want a way out clause? And she's like, honor. What is it that each of you would walk away from the relationship for? And I'm like, or because of, not for, but because of. And I'm like, oh, well, Dan used to be a junkie. I remember Dan as a junkie back in high school. I remember what Dan was like. I would not be in a safe place. If Dan did drugs again, including alcohol, I would be out the door with the bank account if there was anything left. And she's like, well, that's a good clause. That's a termination clause. And we have a different word for it. I have that as well. So if I do drugs, relationship's over, contract null and void. If Dan does drugs or alcohol, relationship over, contract null and void. The other one is if either one of us cheats. So Dan and I are polyamorous. There is no reason for cheating. Does it happen? Yes. My first boyfriend, after marriage, cheated on me. So yes, it does happen. But if it happens between me and him with a relationship that is supposed to be built on complete trust and transparency, something is very, very wrong with the dynamic and it would be over. Okay, so we have an exit clause. Now, the other part of the clause is so those are like termination clause. The other clause that we have is if one of us wants out of the relationship. We also have this total belief of honor. So if either one of us wants out of the relationship, we cannot walk out. We can, but we don't want to. So for us, there's 3 steps that we have to follow to get out of the relationship. So one is to make it known to the other party that we want out. The second is to get a mediator. And our friend Jan, who is still around, she has been nominated as our mediator because she's friends with us, but she's not friends with one of us more than the other. We're over the years, we're still kind of acquaintances, but she is very honorable. So we would bring it to her and she would try to mediate. And then if that didn't work, it's time for a ritual. Dan and I are very much about ritual beginnings and endings, which is why we like the collaring and the celebration. But if we decided to end things, then we would build a fire, bring a printed form of our contract, rip it up, and throw it in the fire. So this is all stated in our contract. I mean, do you know how hard that is to sit there and talk to each other about how you're going to end things when you're trying to create things? But because I know that stuff is in place, I have a feeling of safety, which helps me surrender and be my best following self, right? So, like I said, it's not a guarantee. Obviously, he can walk out, throw me out, whatever. Things could go weird, but we know that we're both honorable people and that we did this contract in good faith. And this is what we would probably stick with. Okay, so parts of the contract, and I know a lot of people get interested in this part, right? But I've already covered a little bit of it. So the parts that you include depends on what you want out of this contract. Our first one was 8 pages. Dan's was 2, mine was 6. I'm the verbose one, so I'm the one that put a lot of detail in there. I really wanted to know that this was what he wanted to do. He was taking on responsibility by being my leader. We decided we were going to have a punishment dynamic. Not everybody has a punishment dynamic. That's something you have to talk about, right? So I like punishment because I get to atone for whatever I did or think I did. And it helps me to stop beating myself up for days and days and weeks, right? So I like a punishment dynamic. Kevin and Katie, who we wrote the book with, there's some questions in there that people have asked us about punishment, and they can't answer that because they do not have a punishment dynamic. They have a reward dynamic, which is also kind of cool. So what you put in there depends on who you are. We had a statement of intent, so a mission statement, right? And again, that's where you would talk about, if you're long distance, what it is you're trying to accomplish with the relationship. For me, our statement of intent was who we were, what our starting date was, a general summary of the type of relationship we were designing and the goal that we had out of the year, and the time period. So that's what we had in there. Terms was another section, which is the style of contract, the style of relationship, long distance, sex slave, service slave, administration slave, now there's soft dom, daddy dom, all these things. What style of relationship are you trying to create? There's all kinds of words. Needs and wants. So needs, and the way I describe needs is something that's non-negotiable. And as a slave, I can still have needs that are non-negotiable that I need to make him aware of, right? And make him aware of before he signs the contract. And this is probably what took us the longest in figuring out what it is that we needed, because what we did before the contract was we considered ourselves DS light, which meant we would toe dip. We would send the kids off to their dads. Dan would give me a code word. I would know that we were in power exchange for the weekend and let the games begin. And we would explore and try different things and try different styles and see how I reacted when he gave me a command, and see if this is really what I wanted and he wanted, or was it just fantasy and we should stay bedroom king, right? So we tried all that stuff, and through that exploration I was able to figure out what my needs were. Now, for me, my needs probably takes up 2 pages in the original contract. And some of them confused Dan because I would put, I need to take care of your house. And this was a need for me because with my ex-husband, when he left socks on the floor, rage would fly into me because I felt taken advantage of, right? But I really wanted to take care of someone's house that was also taking care of me and wasn't taking advantage of me. So I had a need to take care of his house. Plus, I saw how him and his wife had interacted, and some of the stuff that she did household wise. I was like, no, that's not the type of life I want to provide for him. I need to take care of his house. I want, negotiable, I want his help when I'm overwhelmed. So I need to take care of his house. I want his help when I'm overwhelmed. Boy, we had to have a long discussion about what the hell that meant. And I think he still gets confused because I'm like, I need to to take care of the RV, but I am so swamped. Do you mind taking out the trash? And he's like, so things like that. So we've had to have those discussions, needs versus wants. Another one of my needs, which is non-negotiable, is I have to be able to walk my spiritual path. I just have to. I cannot have someone stand in the way of me discovering my spiritual self and doing what I need to do. Now, if I'm going to go to a weekend con that involves the classes that I want to take for my spiritual self, if I want to go to that, I'll still go to Dan and ask, hey, do we have anything going on this weekend? Do you have any reason why you would think I shouldn't go? Things like that. I still interact with him, but I need to have that ability. Dan, on his need list, he has need to be trusted, need to be able to walk his spiritual path, which has involved him becoming a monk twice, a Buddhist monk twice, once as a celibate Buddhist monk. That's in his contract. His third need was he had a need to be silly. And he put that in there because he saw me trying to box him into leather master stoic. Dan is not stoic. Dan is not he at a leather event, man, when he's wearing his leather, he can come across like that. But the next day we would be at the space and he would be in jeans and a t-shirt and skipping and singing and meow, 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 and doing his silly stuff. And people would look at me and I'd be like, it's in the contract. We negotiated this. He's allowed to be silly. Off he goes. So things like that. Think about things. What are your core needs that are about you? Wants are negotiable. I have all kinds of wants. I want to be spanked every week for cathartic emotional release. I'm not leaving him because it doesn't happen. It's a want. A desire is that cherry on top. I need power exchange. That's one of my needs. I need kink that involves power exchange. So power exchange is my fetish. Kink, BDSM is my kink of how I get my fetish met. Where was I going with that? Need, want. Oh, so I need power exchange. I want weekly spankings that involve power exchange. And my desire would be that I'm at a dungeon in front of all the people as I get spanked with yeah, so you see how it layers. So way back when, there used to be this thing called 128 slave duties. And I came across that and I was reading that. And this was about the time we were designing our contract. And I was reading that and I was reading these duties. And I was like, oh, Dan, I can't do this. And there was things on that list, and I can't find it now. I should go back in my old Dropbox and see if I have a copy. But there were things in it. And if this is your jam, I'm not stepping on your feet. You do you. Your kink is your kink. Your power exchange is your power exchange. But there were things in there like a slave was not allowed to, okay, this is going to be a little TMI, guys, but a slave was not allowed to wear a tampon without their master's permission, or just things like that. And I'm like, Dan, I cannot do that. Dan's like, I wouldn't expect you to do that. I'm like, oh, well, this list says I should do it. He's like, that's not my list. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, there's not a set way of doing things. So that's when you get to have the discussions. So, what are the duties of each party? Sometimes when we think duties, we think of slave duties, making the bed, walking the dog, taking out the trash, and all of that could be. But also, what are the duties of the leader? What are the duties of the master, right? What are they responsible for? Rights. Rights is another section. And the reason I wanted that section was because I needed to have voice. So the rights that I needed, because both of us have a need to be polyamorous. And all of this kinds of gets mixed up when you start thinking about it. So I needed rights in there. And my main thing that I was stumbling over at the beginning was how to be power exchange and polyamorous. Okay. Again, we're designing something. When we decided we were going to be polyamorous, the word was so brand new that we had not heard of it yet. We didn't hear of it until we started a couple years later going to the Church of All Worlds call. And one of the creators of call is the person attributed with creating that word. So that's where we ended up hearing it. And so we're trying, so my main malfunction when my brain turned to spaghetti was when we were trying to do both at the same time. And I wanted to be vocal about the polyamorous stuff that was making me feel so crazy. And I didn't know how to do it with a power exchange dynamic. I didn't want to yell at him. And yeah, I respect him too much to yell at him, but that's all I had been taught. So we had not created a communication tool when we designed our first contract. By the time the second contract came around, we had porch time in place. And porch time was our communication tool to talk to each other. There's more about it in the book. You can do anything from like porch time to talking sticks to there's all kinds of communication tools for those big conversations that you could put into your power exchange dynamic. So we did not put it in the first one. We always recommend that there's some sort of communication tool that you can use in your power exchange dynamic. We made sure to put it in the second one. There should never be a time that either one of you say, I didn't know how to tell you. So build a communication tool so that both of you have a way of talking about the big things. And then disillusionment. You know, when relationships break up, this community is really, really small. So if you're going to look for another partner, you want to make sure you've done it with honor. So a disillusionment statement provides that way of doing it with honor. And then how often, write it in there. How often is this going to get updated and by who? And then sign it and celebrate. We had huge celebrations when we re-signed our contract, and we always recommend, I mean, we are very much about rites of passage and ritual. So when I got this collar, I mean, this was ritualized and it's fun. It's a rite of passage. It's an, you know, these relationships are not easy. They can be easier when you have role models or when you have places to get information from, but they can still be really hard. Media and our families teach us something very, very different than how many of us have decided to live in this power exchange life, right? All right, like I said at the beginning, everything I do can be found on eroticawakening.com. I'll have the classes up again there soon. There's like 30 some, and the podcast is there. Where we're going to be is there. All the stuff is there. You can sign up for our newsletter, get our Discord channel information, that elusive Discord channel, and all the good stuff.